World War II brought the need for accurate and timely information to an unprecedented level. Receiving or denying enemy information quickly became a central tenet of military strategy. Electronic espionage, the interception and analysis of radio waves, entered the heart of military operations. Advances in radar, radio transmitters, and eavesdropping equipment created a new arena for competition. In the short term, the ability to see the enemy before they saw him gave tactical advantage. Early radars made it possible to detect aircraft and ships at long distances. The British radar network, known as Chain Home, was an example of a practical application of this technology. The network relayed early warning information to command centers so that defenses could be organized. In turn, the enemy sought ways to evade and defeat radar systems. At the same time, radio interception and signal navigation became a vital tool for discovering the location of enemy units. Listening stations scattered around the world recorded radio messages and sent them to analysis centers. HF by DF devices provided the ability to determine the approximate direction of the transmitter. Combining the navigation of several stations made it possible to calculate the approximate location of the transmitter. This ability was especially crucial in detecting enemy submarines when they were transmitting messages. Submarines were forced to transmit messages in order to communicate, which made them vulnerable to interception. Radio interception became a source of information that enabled commanders to make preemptive decisions. Along with interception, encryption and attempts to maintain the secrecy of messages emerged as a fundamental countermeasure. Machinery and sophisticated encryption methods intensified the effort to protect information. The Allies analyzed a large proportion of enemy messages by establishing decoding centers and specialized manpower. Belfast, Bletchley Park, and other centers became vital centers for network analysis. Decoding was based on mathematics, logic, and mechanical and electronic engineering. The information obtained from decoding, while valuable, had to be used with caution. The overt use of decoded information could quickly reveal its source. For this reason, operations were planned so that the source of the information remained hidden. Information warfare was not just about eavesdropping and decoding. It also included the production of disinformation and deception. Sending false messages and disrupting enemy communications was used to distort its decision-making. Radio jamming or signal mixing was a means of simultaneously disrupting enemy guidance and coordination. Jamming transmitters made real messages illegible by producing noise or interfering signals. These active practices found widespread applications at the tactical and strategic levels. Early electronic warfare units were responsible for creating and managing these jammers. Training of signal operators and analysts became critical to exploiting the information. Interception personnel had to be able to recognize patterns and extract relevant content from the mass of signals. The creation of rapid reporting networks between interception, analysis, and command increased the efficiency of decisions. Naval and air electronic warfare demonstrated the direct interaction between technology, tactics, and logistics. Effective interception required ground stations, ships, and aircraft. Coastal stations and escort ships equipped with antennas and navigation devices operated on anti-submarine patrols. Short-range reconnaissance aircraft also played an important role in intercepting and relaying signals. SIGINT information directly guided naval and air operations. SIGINT focused on the content of messages, while LNIT focused more on the characteristics of radio signals. Combining these two types of data created a more comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and positions. Analysis of frequency characteristics and propagation patterns helped identify the type of enemy equipment. Finding weaknesses in the enemy's communication network required time, resources, and expertise. Commanders could use electronic information to determine the concentration of forces or attacks in a targeted manner. Success in the Battle of the Atlantic depended largely on the ability to intercept and disrupt enemy shipping. By combining radio interception and code breaking, the Allies gradually identified navigation and convoy patterns. This information enabled them to set up ambushes and plan air and naval support. On the other hand, the Axis attempted to keep information secure by changing communication procedures and codes. Changes in communication protocols, timing of messages, and the use of complex codes were among the measures employed. However, any change in communication methods required extensive training and coordination of forces. Balancing information security with the need for rapid communication was a constant challenge. At times, radio silence was used as a tactic to make it more difficult for the enemy to locate their bearings. However, communication silence created limitations in coordinating operations. Some units resorted to physical methods to maintain electronic superiority. Examples of these methods were manual encryption or local messaging. The field of research and development in the field of electronics grew rapidly and transformed the military industry. Factories and research centers were quickly involved in the production and improvement of listening and decoding devices. The employment of specialized manpower, including mathematicians, engineers, and linguists, to analyze data became a necessity. Logistical support of listening and radar stations, from antennas to generating plants, was part of daily operations. Maintaining the secrecy of listening and analysis activities became the most widespread security mechanism of the era. Any leak of information about the interception capability could provide the enemy with countermeasures. To prevent exposure, many decoding centers were located in secret infrastructure or far from war zones. In some cases, interception activities led to direct pursuit and attack of stations or rear lines. Protecting these facilities required security units and defensive measures. At the same time, the enemy also attempted to use deceptive information to distract analysts. Proxies, fake messages, and manipulation of radio traffic were techniques that were used. Professional analysts had to be able to distinguish between real and engineered information. The role of manpower in all of these processes was decisive. Machines were tools, but human interpretation was key. Fatigue, analytical errors, and time pressure could lead to poor decision-making. To improve the quality of analysis, systems for exchanging information between units and countries were developed. Cooperation among the Allies in exchanging signet information marked a turning point in information warfare. The division of tasks between interception, decoding, and operational exploitation centers led to greater efficiency. However, intelligence competition between the military branches and domestic intelligence services sometimes hindered coordination. The process of converting raw interception data into action required a chain of rapid and accurate decision-making. The faster and more accurately analysts could provide information, the more effective the field response. Signals interception capabilities also helped to uncover hidden infrastructure, depots, and supply routes. Intercepting radio networks and intercepting logistics messages was a valuable source for targeting enemy supplies. At the operational level, combining electronic data with visual and human evidence produced a more accurate picture. Special volunteer units supplemented local intelligence gathering and helped to strengthen analyses. Electronic information sometimes informed decisions to launch precision airstrikes or send ships into ambush positions. This type of data usage reduced friendly casualties and increased the accuracy of attacks. But over-reliance on interception data could also lead to false confidence. In some cases, the enemy misled analysts by changing behavior or ciphers. Field feedback and careful evaluation of results were essential to refine analyses. Electronic warfare and signals intelligence expanded the concept of the battlefield beyond land and water. Radio waves and electromagnetic energy themselves became the medium for warfare. Eventually, the ability to collect, analyze and use electronic information became a determining factor in winning operations. The experiences and lessons of this period formed the foundations of modern information warfare and subsequent specialized disciplines. Radio interception networks developed into a complex, multi-layered structure during World War II. Specialized units, commonly known as Y stations, were stationed on beaches, remote islands, and high ground. These stations were tasked with receiving, recording, and reporting any enemy radio signals. The purpose of the interception was to identify the type of transmitter, the transmission pattern, and, if possible, the content of the message. Operators spent long shifts in narrow wooden cabins or concrete shelters. The monotonous hum of radio waves, noise, and interference were the only constant sounds around them. Any unidentified signal could be a vital clue to the enemy's location or intentions. Dozens of Y stations were active around the British coastline, 24/7. The network expanded steadily from the beginning of the war to cover more frequencies and areas. Each station had large wire or rotating antennas installed to receive long-range waves. Early reports included time of reception, frequency, signal strength, and behavioral characteristics. This data was transmitted without delay in code to analysis centers. The most important analysis center was Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom, which sorted the messages. The data was then sent to experts in decoding, linguistics, and military analysis. The extensive listening capability provided an approximate picture of enemy communication patterns. The combination of information increased when HF-DF wave direction finding technology was introduced. These devices plotted an approximate line to the transmitter by examining the direction of the waves. Several stations receiving a signal at the same time determined the approximate location of the transmitter by intersecting the lines. This method quickly became important in the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines had to transmit messages to coordinate their operations. Each message, however short, could give away the submarine's position. Operators of the Y stations were constantly listening for short HF messages. Sometimes a submarine would only send a message for a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough. The first escort boats equipped with HF-DF were able to determine the approximate direction of the enemy's signal while at sea. This ability took convoys out of a purely defensive mode. Commanders could now choose safer routes based on the direction of the signal, or, in some cases, direct anti-submarine patrol aircraft to the same spot. The intercept data revealed not only immediate threats, but also enemy operational habits. Analysis of the common frequencies showed which bands the enemy preferred. Examination of the duration of the messages revealed the communication pattern of the command and the transmission hierarchy. Sometimes, several consecutive messages from different units indicated a concentration of forces in a particular area. This data was valuable even without decoding. Elitin relied heavily on these technical features. A sudden change in message sending habits was a warning of an impending operation. With months of experience, operators were able to distinguish between normal and sudden patterns. Weather conditions also sometimes affected the range and quality of the signals. Engineers and meteorologists played an important role in interpreting the disturbances. As equipment increased, the stations required constant power and large batteries. Local power grids were sometimes inadequate, requiring independent generators. For this reason, the engineering units were constantly engaged in maintenance. Any electrical failure could disrupt a crucial period of interception. Y stations were often built in remote areas to reduce electrical noise. This isolation also contributed to operational security. It was important that the stations were hidden from the enemy. Some stations were set up on small islands in the Atlantic or Indian Oceans. These locations allowed for deeper interception into enemy areas. The operators in these areas faced poor facilities and harsh climatic conditions, but the intelligence value of their work outweighed the difficulties. Thousands of messages were received daily, and their recording generated a huge volume of raw data.
Sorting and sending this data required careful organization. Operators recorded messages on paper tapes or on sheets of paper. Reports were sent to higher headquarters in simple transmission codes. At analysis centers, data were recorded in structured forms. Analysts then looked for connections between data points. Each new data point was checked to see if it was consistent with previous data. If it was consistent, it was added to the signal map. If it was inconsistent, it was double-checked to identify the source of the error. Sometimes, the inconsistency itself was an indication of a change in enemy tactics. Over time, maps of signal density were created. These maps showed where communications were most active. During the Battle of the Atlantic, active areas were often important to enemy naval command. Intercepting enemy Central Command messages allowed analysis of larger operational intentions. Sometimes it was possible to guess which command was involved from the pattern of transmissions. Some enemy units had a particular style of sending messages, and these characteristics could be identified. A change in tone or frequency might indicate damage or a change of commander. In addition to technical specifications, analysts also examined the history of transmissions. In addition to interception, identifying the content was also important, but encryption was the main obstacle. However, even undecrypted information was valuable because it showed that communication was taking place, how long it was, and where it was occurring. The longer the messages, the greater the risk of the sender being discovered. So the enemy tried to shorten the messages. But shortening the messages also increased the complexity of analysis. Methods were developed to assess the potential content based on structure, repetition, and timing. Gradually, communication between interception units in the various Allied countries was established. Data was exchanged securely between Britain, the United States, and its allies. This cooperation demonstrated the international importance of information warfare. To maintain security, reports were sent in internal codes. Each internal message also had a priority that determined its processing path. In some cases, urgent reports were sent directly to operational units. This allowed for a rapid response to a threat. In areas where maritime communications were vital, large ships themselves were floating interception stations. These ships were considered golden listening points in lines far from the coast. Aircraft also sometimes intercepted signals with lighter equipment, but flying conditions and fuel limitations shortened their operations. Nevertheless, their instantaneous data was invaluable. Sometimes the aircraft would transmit data directly to the command of the escort boats. This speed of information transmission gave the Allies an opportunity to ambush. In turn, the enemy tried to change the transmission patterns. Sometimes, radio silence was implemented as a tactic, but this silence sometimes negatively affected their own operations. The HF-DF network proved that even intermittent silence was a sign of activity, because the sudden interruption of messages was valuable information in itself. Gradually, the enemy realized that the electromagnetic field was now part of the battlefield. But improving tactics required time, coordination, and technology. In many cases, these improvements were made late. Thus, the WWII networks and the HF-DF system laid the foundations of modern information warfare. Their role in creating Allied operational superiority, especially at sea, was decisive. These structures later evolved into post-war reconnaissance and surveillance systems, transforming the shape of modern warfare.
On the eve of World War II, the concept of radar was still a young and unknown technology. But this fledgling technology quickly became the backbone of Allied air defense. The original British plan for a radar network was formed in the 1930s. The network became known as the Chain Home and was built along the coast. The antennas were massive metal towers that loomed like ghosts on the coastline. Their job was to send out radio waves and receive signals reflected from distant targets. In this way, enemy aircraft could be detected before they reached the shore. The system was the first practical example of a national early warning system. The early detection of German aircraft made it possible to implement a coordinated defense. Each station had a different range and a specific angular coverage. The coverage of these stations covered the entire south coast of England like pieces of a puzzle. When the reflected signal was received, the data was processed quickly. Ground operators determined the range of the target based on the intensity and timing of the signal. The scan angle also revealed approximate information about the direction of approach of the target. The outputs were recorded on vector maps and transmitted to command centers. Fighter Command combined this data with the reports of the lookouts. This combined data gave an accurate picture of the course and number of enemy aircraft. The result was that defensive squadrons were only dispatched when needed. This saved manpower and fuel. In addition, pilot fatigue was reduced. Defensive operations became targeted combat, not blind patrolling. In the Battle of Britain, this network played a crucial role. Enemy aircraft were identified on their approach from afar. Command could make decisions before the enemy. Decision-making was now based on electronic data. This was the first example of the use of real-time information on a national level. Combining radar information with ground control multiplied the precision of defense. Pilots received direct orders from ground centers via radio. For this reason, squadrons were guided exactly on the right course and at the desired altitude. This coordination reduced the number of aircraft involved. In return, engagements were carried out more effectively and coherently. The enemy's numerical superiority was balanced by the Allied intelligence superiority. Germany did not anticipate that Britain would be able to create such an early warning network. For this reason, the first wave of attacks failed to break through the British defenses. Chain Home operated 24 hours a day. Operators worked under intense pressure and had little time to rest. Any mistake could result in the loss of towns and troops. Early radar technology was crude, but it proved effective. Antennas were long and fixed and could not be rotated quickly. These limitations were overcome by the skill of the operators. Height determination was challenging and required supplementary methods. Visual lookouts and local reports were used to confirm altitude. Nevertheless, direction and distance estimates were well done. The command center displayed this data on large maps with markers and markers. Special officers moved these markers to update the course of the targets. The output of these maps was fed to the senior officer for tactical decisions. As soon as a new wave was detected, the order to prepare was issued. Ground control determined which squadron should respond. Some squadrons were stationed in the immediate area, some in the rear. This constant monitoring ensured that the enemy never gained the upper hand. The Germans tried various flight paths to counter the attack, but the extensive Chain Home network thwarted most of these attempts. Sometimes the enemy would try to fly at very low altitudes, but ground lookouts and support stations would detect them. Gradually, improved versions of radar with altitude detection capabilities were introduced. Along with the coast, some inland locations were also equipped with stations. These stations were used to cover blind spots and provide depth for the defense. Alongside ground radar, efforts began to mount radar on aircraft. This was mostly done to hunt down bombers at night. Night warfare was almost impossible without radar. But installing early radar on aircraft was a major technical challenge. These devices were heavy and required a lot of power. As technology advanced, smaller and more efficient versions were built. Night fighter aircraft used radar to detect the enemy in the dark. This method increased the accuracy of interception and expanded the defense capability. The simultaneous use of ground-based and airborne radar created a multi-layered defense structure. Germany also tried to make progress in the field of radar. They developed different and stealthy radar systems. But the vast and coherent network of the Allies had a tangible operational advantage. Jamming devices also gradually entered the field. The most common method was to create noise on the enemy radar frequencies. This method reduced the accuracy and sometimes blinded the system. But operators soon became familiar with the noise patterns. Methods were developed to filter out the interfering signals. Crosstalk between stations also helped to identify real targets. The chain home network remained operational, albeit with limitations, until the end of the war. The network not only protected Britain from air attacks, but also formed the basis of modern defenses. After the war, many countries set about building similar networks. Experience gained in interpreting radar data in wartime helped to design later early warning systems. Along with radar, communications coordination played a crucial role. Without an effective communication system, radar information was useless. A robust radio network was therefore created to transmit data quickly. Messages were sent in short, standardized formats. This format reduced errors and accelerated analysis. The combination of radar, interception, and centralized command was the epitome of modern information warfare. The goal was to exploit raw data to make precise tactical decisions. This pattern was repeated in subsequent operations on land and at sea. The success of Chain Home proved that technology could be effective even in its early stages. The network spurred the scientific and industrial community to further research. Laboratories, factories, and universities began developing more advanced radars. Radar went from being a rudimentary technology to a standard tool in the Air Force. Eventually, the integration of radar, analysis, and field action introduced a more complete form of warfare. A war in which information played as decisive a role as ammunition.
In the midst of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic became one of the most crucial theaters of the conflict. Large convoys of merchant ships had to reach Britain from the United States and Canada. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, and vital parts were transported along this route. German submarines, U-boats, were the main threat to these convoys. They used the darkness and silence of the deep sea to attack. At the beginning of the war, naval protection of convoys was difficult, because submarines were almost impossible to detect with the naked eye. Aircraft could also only patrol effectively during the day. Night and bad weather made conditions very favorable for U-boats. The most important development in this battle was the introduction of naval radar. Initially, ships used rudimentary short-range radars. These radars were useful for detecting surface targets, such as moving submarines. Over time, improved versions were introduced. These systems were even able to detect the protruding turret of a submarine. This advantage allowed ships to keep the convoy safe at night. Most U-boat attacks were carried out at night, but the new radar took away this advantage. Any movement of the U-boat above the surface could reveal its position. Therefore, the submarines were forced to move more underwater. Moving below the surface reduced speed and limited the ability to pursue the convoy. This tactical change put Germany in a difficult position. In contrast, the Allies took the initiative relying on radar. Cooperation between escort ships and patrol aircraft was strengthened. Patrol aircraft were also equipped with airborne radars. This significantly increased the area of defense coverage. Darkness was no longer a good opportunity to attack. In many cases, U-boats were detected before they reached firing range. This allowed for rapid interception and engagement. The combination of radar and sonar on ships was the main tool for hunting submarines. Radar was used for surface detection and sonar for subsurface detection. If surface detection was achieved, the ship would approach quickly. Then, using sonar, it would track the submarine's path. The final attack was carried out using depth charges. These weapons were dropped from the ship into the water like bombs. Once they reached a certain depth, they exploded, creating a shockwave. If a submarine was nearby, severe damage or destruction was certain. Finally, the combination of radar and sonar information increased the operational capabilities of the ships. At the same time, the main goal was to defend convoys, not necessarily to hunt.
Therefore, tactics were focused on protection. But the hunt for submarines gradually paid off, and their losses increased. Germany tried to increase the pressure by using the Wolfpack tactic. In this method, several U-boats would attack the convoy at the same time. But with the development of radar, their gatherings could be detected. Each gathering could reveal the general position of the group. Patrol aircraft were dispatched to the area based on radar data. This action caused the groups to disperse. The result was a decrease in the success of the Wolfpack tactic. In addition to the sea surface, radar was also used in navigation. In bad weather or fog, radar allowed ships to maintain course. It also made it possible to detect maritime obstacles. This technology reduced the risk of collisions or deviations. Along with the ships, new aircraft such as the Liberator entered the field. These planes had long-range and powerful radar. They were able to cover areas far from the ships. This coverage extended the defensive ring. U-boats became unsafe even in remote areas. At first, Germany could not find a way to counter radar. But later, they developed radar warning devices. These devices were able to detect enemy radar waves. When the wave was detected, the crew received an alert. This alert caused the submarine to immediately dive. But a quick response was not always possible. Often, the interval between the alert and the ship firing was very short. The Allies also experimented with different frequencies. This made the warning devices lose their effectiveness. In addition to radar, decoding operations also played a vital role. The Germans used the Enigma machine to encrypt messages. By breaking the Enigma code, the Allies obtained information about the movements of the U-boats. This combination of decoding and radar detection was very effective. The convoys changed their course based on the decoded data. Thus, many confrontations were thwarted before they even happened. The German government realized these successes too late. By the time fundamental changes were made, casualties had already been high. New types of radar were installed on small ships, even with smaller masts. Now, almost every escort ship could detect the enemy. This increased the speed of response and coordination. In some parts of the ocean, listening stations were also set up. They monitored the radio signals of U-boats. This listening complemented the radar and gave a better picture of the battlefield. While sonar determined the subsurface course, radar determined the surface direction. This combination reduced the possibility of submarines escaping. In the latter part of the war, many U-boats were forced to hide at great depths. This tactic reduced their speed and survivability. Thus, they were deprived of the possibility of a highly concentrated attack. Ultimately, the widespread use of radar ensured Allied domination of the Atlantic. Shipping continued, and Britain was saved from economic collapse. By maintaining supply lines, major land operations in Europe became possible. Radar was not only a reconnaissance technology, but also the key to naval superiority. An important lesson from the battle was the value of accurate and timely information. Communication between ships, aircraft, and command was based on radar data. This pattern was repeated in future naval and submarine battles. After the war, radar became the basic standard for all major fleets. The Battle of the Atlantic was a clear example of the role technology played in determining the outcome of a war. The changing range of engagement, speed of response, and resource management all proceeded on the basis of radar. This system, along with interception and decoding, completed the information warfare network.
Electronic warfare in World War II was the active and passive use of electromagnetic waves to gain operational advantage. The first generation of EW focused more on radio interception and jamming than on the cyber or digital attacks that emerged later. EW applications included radar jamming, radio communications jamming, and the broadcasting of deceptive messages. Radio jamming was usually accomplished by generating interfering signals or noise to make enemy messages unreadable. Jamming equipment was designed to cover the enemy's frequency range rather than providing technical instructions. In practice, EW units were deployed behind lines or on ships and aircraft to provide physical security. Active jamming could momentarily paralyze enemy coordination, buying time to execute operations. On the other hand, radio deception involved sending fake messages or imitating enemy command networks to confuse them. Both offensive and defensive electronic warfare required specialized teams of operators, analysts, and engineers. Operators had to understand the patterns of signal propagation to distinguish real signals from deception. EW units were often coordinated with intelligence and operational units to maximize the effect of disruption or deception. One method of deception was to send fake messages with content designed to mislead enemy command. These messages might include orders to change course, make timing errors, or create false reports of casualties. For the deception to be successful, the fake sender had to match the enemy's real patterns in terms of timing, frequency, and message style. In many cases, enemy analysts were able to detect deception by examining the details of the style and format of the message. Radar jamming was a vital goal in countering air defenses, as radar was the focus of warning and interception. Methods of radar jamming ranged from creating noise to sending jamming signals that produced false returns. Another common practice was the spread of radar reflective coatings, later known as chaff or windows. These coatings produce numerous and scattered radar returns, making it difficult for radar operators to detect. The combined use of chaff, jamming, and deception enabled the attacking force to easily bypass radar zones. Defense units also began developing methods to filter out false returns and distinguish the real target. Responses to jamming and deception included frequency shifting, enhanced filtering, and the use of secondary sources of detection. In many major operations, coordination between EW and combat units was key to success. A field example was that EW units were activated to provide cover and reduce enemy radar warnings before an air attack. In some cases, the jamming was so effective that enemy air defenses were temporarily blinded or slowed to react. But the jamming was not always complete and sometimes revealed the sources of the jamming. The risk of EW units being exposed required them to use camouflage and physical protection. Radio jamming could also affect friendly communications, so careful coordination was required. To reduce side effects, friendly units used specific communication protocols and predetermined schedules. Frequency spectrum management became important as a limited resource, and planning for simultaneous use became vital. Electronic warfare gradually moved from simple tactics to systematization and the use of more sophisticated equipment. Training of personnel was a major challenge in the development of EW, as operators had to learn patterns quickly. Specialized EW groups were created within the Air Force, Navy, and Army to centralize skills. Logistical issues included the supply of components, antennas, power generators, and maintenance of the devices. EW units had to be moved in the field, and this movement itself carried risks. In some operations, EW units were mounted on escort ships to provide close support for naval operations. Aircraft equipped with jamming equipment provided electronic attack capability over the battle area. These aircraft could provide jamming coverage of the target area for a short period of time. However, fuel and operational range limitations limited their operational duration. In some missions, higher-powered ground stations were used for long-term support. Any jamming activity had to be carefully timed to minimize interference with friendly operations. In the tactical domain, jamming could disrupt the timing of bombing raids and ensure victory. In the strategic domain, electronic warfare could slow or completely disrupt the flow of enemy information.
Early EW weapons were relatively large in size and weight, requiring fixed or semi-fixed deployment. Technological advances led to the miniaturization of equipment and increased mobility of EW units late in the war. Jamming became more adjustable and selective, allowing parts of the spectrum to be targeted rather than entire bands. This selectivity helped reduce unwanted effects on friendly communications. In some cases, the enemy countered by shifting frequencies or using stronger encryption protocols. The flow of developments on each side was a constant race to develop new methods and counter them. At the intelligence level, disclosure of EW capabilities could give the enemy a chance to counter. Therefore, secrecy was crucial. Accurate and timely reporting from field units to analysis centers allowed for tactical adjustments. Operator fatigue, environmental noise, and human error sometimes reduced the effectiveness of EW operations. Analyzing field feedback after each operation led to the development of new protocols and standards. From a legal and ethical perspective, some deception and disruption methods also had civilian consequences and raised concerns. In operations targeting urban areas, disruption could disrupt public services. These side effects caused some commanders to exercise caution before employing EW more widely. Nevertheless, the intelligent use of EW made many major operations possible or less costly. Examples of successful operations in which EW played a supporting role included coordinated air and amphibious assaults. In these operations, radar jamming and radio deception paved the way for the attacker. Enemy units that lacked the appropriate training or equipment were more vulnerable. After the war, EW lessons led to the establishment of specialized branches and the development of related technologies. Some of the acquired technologies were applied in civilian areas such as medicine and everyday communications. But the basis of modern electronic warfare was rooted in the evolution of tactics and equipment during this period of war. Ultimately, EW demonstrated that controlling the electromagnetic spectrum and information could be as effective in the field as firepower. This part of information warfare laid the groundwork for the formation of the concepts of cybersecurity and information space dominance in later periods. Its field consequence was clear. Wherever you controlled the waves, you could limit or direct the actions of the enemy. As a result, command units quickly adopted EW as one of the essential tools in planning operations.
Radio deception operations were the production and transmission of fake messages or manipulation of radio traffic to mislead the enemy. This type of operation was part of the information warfare toolkit. Radio deception could be used at the tactical level to create momentary opportunities or at the strategic level to change the enemy's plans. A prerequisite for successful deception was a thorough understanding of the enemy's communication patterns and language of messages. If the fake sender did not send in a style, format, and timing similar to the enemy's real messages, the deception was more likely to be revealed. To design fake messages, signal analysts and linguists worked closely together. They reconstructed idiomatic patterns, message structure, and common frequencies. In some cases, deception teams used recordings of real messages to create near-identical samples. These samples were then processed to produce fake messages. A common use of deception was to send false reports about the location or time of an operation. By disseminating false information, the enemy could move his forces to the wrong area. The result of this displacement was a reduction in the concentration of forces in the actual area of attack. The deception could create opportunities for surprise air or naval attacks. In some major operations, radio deception was carried out in coordination with physical and media measures. The purpose of this coordination was to create a credible view of the fake information. For example, before an attack, fake messages were issued about the movement of supply units. These messages were then confirmed by local lookouts or agents to increase the authenticity of the deception. A famous historical example was the Allied deception operations prior to Normandy, which involved broadcasting false information about the location of the invasion. In those programs, fake radio messages, along with physical measures such as building fake equipment and spreading rumors, created widespread confusion. The creation of imaginary armies and the planning of fake movements played a significant role in the success of the invasion. At the tactical level, small units also used radio deception to distract the enemy on local fronts. For example, sending messages indicating that a larger number of units were concentrated in one direction could attract supporting fire to that direction. In some cases, deception messages were sent to show heavy losses or false retreats to pressure the enemy. These types of messages could undermine enemy morale or cause them to react nervously and irrationally. Another technique was to forge station and command messages to create confusion in the enemy chain of command. Sending fake orders signed by higher units could cause inappropriate and harmful actions to be taken. These methods required skill in reproducing command language and structural codes. Being prepared to exploit fake messages required the presence of forces to quickly execute operations after the deception. Without the operational capacity to exploit the deception effect, simply sending fake messages was ineffective. In some operations, radio deception was combined with jamming on key frequencies to reduce the enemy's ability to respond immediately. The simultaneity between the content deception and the transmission disruption increased the effectiveness of the operation. The enemy in turn developed ways to detect fake messages. One method was to analyze the sender's behavior and match it to historical records and natural patterns. If a unit always sent messages at a certain time and a fake message came out of the usual pattern, analysts would be alerted. Also, careful examination of the message format, terminology, and encryption method could reveal fraud. In cases where messages were encrypted, tampering with the code or the use of incorrect keys could indicate deception. Another method of countering was to gather information from independent sources, such as local lookouts and visual reports. If the intercepted data did not match the evidence on the ground or in the air, the possibility of deception was raised. Training analysts to detect deception became part of the enemy's intelligence defense structure. They looked for internal signs of inconsistency that would distinguish the fake message from the real one. In some cases, the enemy also used decoy messages to detect the source of the deception. By allowing the fake message to be broadcast publicly, the defending forces could track down the fake sender. This method exposed the location of the decoy units and imposed a heavy cost on them. Another enemy response was to change communication protocols to make spoofing more difficult. For example, changes were made to code phrases, timing patterns, or the use of more complex ciphers. These changes, however, required extensive training and retraining of the troops. Thus, the use of decoys could be a catalyst for changes in the enemy's communication methods. In some cases, the enemy temporarily switched from radio methods to physical or other means of communication. These alternative means of communication were usually slower but more secure. Radio deception also involved the use of human agents who broadcast seemingly random telephone or radio messages. The combination of human and electronic information made the deception more believable. In some operations, fake messages were synchronized with visual information to convince enemy analysts. For example, the movement of fake vehicles or smoke from fake construction were presented as physical evidence. The production of a triangle of evidence, auditory, visual, and human, ensured the success of deception. One of the difficulties of deception was the risk of unintended effects on the civilian population. The transmission of false information about safe areas or routes could endanger the lives of civilians. For this reason, some deception operations were designed with limitations to protect civilians. The ethical and political issue of using radio deception in large-scale operations was always a consideration. Nevertheless, in wartime conditions, some commanders gave priority to military results. Examples of deception operations that had a significant impact demonstrate the art of combining information and action. These operations repeatedly demonstrated how information could make or break a maneuver. In some cases, radio deception alone was able to reduce the size of the enemy's response force.
But sustained success required the continuation and repetition of deception techniques and the ability to adapt to enemy counters. For this reason, special organizational structures were formed in the Allies to design and execute deception. These organizations included teams for analysis, content production, and storage of radio resources. They had detailed checklists to ensure the synchronicity and relative authenticity of the fake messages. In some cases, deception messages were produced at different levels to make them appear realistic from every perspective. That is, the tactical message, the logistic message, and the information message were aligned with each other. At the same time, the enemy tried to reduce the effect of deception by forming countermeasure units. These units were tasked with checking the accuracy of the messages, analyzing the sources, and suggesting defensive measures. Technical responses included frequency adjustments, increased surveillance, and the use of stronger encryption systems. Operational responses also included expanding lookouts, increasing patrols, and adjusting operational schedules. Another effect of deception was the allocation of additional resources to verify information. This cost of resources could increase the pressure on the enemy's combat capability. From a strategic perspective, radio deception could lead to enemy information fatigue. The abundance of information and the need for constant verification reduced the enemy's decision-making capacity. But unsuccessful deception could also lead to the disclosure of deception capabilities and sources. Therefore, a risk-reward assessment before any deception operation was crucial. Radio deception, along with other tools of information warfare, opened up a new horizon for military operations. After the war, lessons about deception and how to counter it were incorporated into training courses and methods of information analysis. Studying historical examples of these operations is crucial to understand how information and operations were integrated. The design of radio deception required the selection of appropriate targets, precise timing, and reliable operational capability. In many cases, the most successful deceptions were those that had pre-programmed and managed the level of risk. In the end, radio deception demonstrated that information could not only be collected, but also used as an active weapon. A correct understanding of the information field and the ability to use it was one of the determining factors in the final victory. The experiences of this period laid the theoretical and practical foundations of modern information warfare, and the principles learned from it are still visible in the design of contemporary information operations.
Cryptography and decoding were one of the most vital fronts of information warfare. Codes were used to protect command and control communications. The Enigma machine was the most famous example of mechanical encryption used by Germany. But mechanical encryption was only a small part of the spectrum of codes. Allied decoding centers were organized to break these codes. The most important decoding center was Bletchley Park in Britain. These centers were staffed by teams of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers. Decoding was a multi-stage analytical process. Raw data from listening stations was rapidly transmitted to decoding centers. Operators cataloged and prioritized the recorded messages. Analysts then looked for patterns and repeating mechanisms. It was common to use language and probability to guess parts of a message. Special equipment was built to automate parts of the process, but this equipment was mostly designed to assist analysts. The information obtained from the decoding was codenamed Ultra. Secrecy about the existence of Ultra was of vital importance. Open use of Ultra information could reveal its source, so decision-makers had to balance exploitation and protection. Examples of this balance included guiding ships or bombing using other sources of information. In some operations, the decoded information was used indirectly. That is, the operation was carried out in such a way that it appeared to have been derived from ordinary evidence. This approach allowed the source of the information to remain hidden. The timeliness of Ultra information was as important as its content. Accurate and timely information could greatly increase enemy casualties. Some of the most successful anti-submarine missions were planned using Ultra.
Decryption was also used to track fleet and convoy movements, but the decryption process was time-consuming and expensive. Therefore, messages were prioritized based on their likely content. High-level operational messages were given priority. Decryption centers required specialized equipment to store and process the vast amounts of data. Experts worked long shifts. The pressure of work in secrecy made the work environment difficult and stressful. Decrypted information had to be transmitted quickly to operational command. Secure channels were established to transmit this information. In some cases, secret information was transmitted to the field by indirect methods. Information warfare was meaningless without coordination between interception, decoding, and exploitation. In practice, these three circles had to work with the least delay and the greatest accuracy. This coordination required complex organizational arrangements. Communication and exchange were necessary between different military branches and intelligence agencies. Sometimes, competition between branches prevented the rapid exchange of information. Experience showed that the coordination of intelligence operations had a significant operational impact. Decoded information, in some cases, saved the fleet or prevented an attack. But blind faith in decrypted information could also be detrimental. For this reason, commanders always needed field evaluation. In some operations, ultra data was combined with visual and auditory reports. This integration increased certainty and reduced decision-making risk. Enemy decryption was also a concern on some fronts. Both sides took steps to improve the security of their messages. These included changes in encryption procedures and message timing. Limited use of radio and short messages also became common to reduce the risk of navigation. As a result, the enemy's communications network gradually became more complex and conservative. Some units used alternative methods of communication, such as physical messaging. These methods were more secure but slower. The speed of transmission and quality of information always had to balance security and efficiency. Decryption operations also developed technically during the war. Computing devices and mechanical mechanisms were developed to speed up the process. Nevertheless, creative and skilled manpower still played a decisive role. Analysts had to learn from their mistakes and improve their methods. The analysis after each discovery was recorded and archived to improve procedures. Decryption work required careful record-keeping and document management. Due to the sensitivity of the documents, archiving and storing them under security measures was very difficult. The development of an international network of allies to exchange this information required time and mutual trust. The United States, Britain, and other allies established centers for information exchange. This cooperation made it possible to exploit the decrypted data more effectively. A major challenge was prioritizing resources in times of pressure. In critical situations, deciding which messages to process was crucial. A mistake in prioritization could lead to lost operational opportunities. To prevent this error, human algorithms for prioritization were developed. Exploitation policies were also set to protect the source. For example, decisions were made about why and how important information would be used without revealing the source. Secrecy about the decryption capability was maintained until the end of the war. A widespread disclosure of this capability could lead to new enemy tactics. After the war, reports and documents gradually became available to researchers. Historical analysis has shown that Ultra had a decisive impact at times. But its role was not always the decisive key to victory and must be measured in the context of other factors. Interdisciplinary research on cryptography and decryption grew rapidly. Universities and research centers attracted wartime experts. Many of the techniques developed were later used in civil communications and information security. But during wartime, the main focus was solely on maintaining information and operational superiority. Ethical and legal risks were also involved in decoding. The use of decrypted information against civilians was a complex issue. In general, exploitation policies sought to avoid unintended human consequences. But in wartime, such considerations were sometimes overridden. Analysts also had to assess the effects that the use of the information might have on the enemy's operational structure. If the use of the information led to an immediate change in the enemy's pattern, the source of the decryption would be compromised. Therefore, it was essential to conduct proportionate and calculated operations. Some operations, using ultra carefully, caught enemy naval forces in ambushes. In some cases, the decrypted information proved important in saving convoys or preventing civilian casualties. However, misuse or reliance on information alone could have had damaging consequences. Not unique to wartime, principles for protecting sensitive information were developed later. One important outcome was the birth of methods for managing and classifying classified information. These methods were used in military and government agencies after the war. Decryption played a major role in the development of modern intelligence cooperation between countries. Based on wartime experiences, networks for exchanging security information were formed. In addition to its operational impact, decryption brought about a cultural revolution in computational science. Research on algorithms and communication theories grew rapidly. The experience of interdisciplinary teamwork was also seen as an important organizational lesson. These experiences were later applied in modern scientific and technical projects. Finally, encryption and decryption demonstrated that today's warfare is as much about software and knowledge as it was about hardware. The ability to manage information and make rapid decisions based on it became a key factor on the modern battlefield.
Field units quickly learned that ciphering information was only effective when corroborated by field evidence. Visual reports and aerial reconnaissance were often used to verify decrypted information. In many cases, commanders wanted multiple independent sources to be combined before action was taken. Field missions were conducted to discover signal sources and assembly points using electronic data. Capturing and obtaining enemy cryptographic documents was sometimes the quickest way to obtain the keys. Field intelligence units attempted to identify and record suspected transmitting stations. The discovery and capture of radio equipment or codebooks often helped expedite the decryption process. In practice, the operations of combat intelligence officers on the front lines played a large role in gathering evidence. Infiltration and sabotage operations against enemy communication centers were also carried out to a limited extent. These field operations were always risky and had a high human cost. When the enemy discovered that a cipher had been compromised, he would quickly change it. Changes in communication procedures usually involved revising the keys and protocols used. Rapidly changing keys and ciphers was one of the easiest responses to reduce the effects of ciphering. The use of disposable keys or more complex systems was implemented in some cases, but the procurement, distribution, and coordination of such changes were logistical challenges. In some forces, changing keys meant extensive retraining of operators, which was time-consuming. Systems that relied on rapid messaging were less able to keep up with changing protocols. Thus, the enemy often had to balance security with the need for rapid communication. In response to the information leak, some commanders decided to restrict radio communications. These restrictions included reducing the number of messages, shortening the content, and increasing radio silence. Radio silence, while reducing the likelihood of intrusion, also made coordination more difficult. On some fronts, physical messaging was replaced by the use of written messages. These methods were more secure, but reduced speed and flexibility. The enemy also sought to use local codes and unusual terminology to confuse analysts. The use of vernacular terms or ciphers based on local context made it more difficult to understand the message format. Sometimes a change in phrasing and written format was enough to make short messages less useful to the decoder. Structural changes in the messaging hierarchy were also implemented to break communication patterns.
These changes could include changing communication channels and moving command centers. One common response was to divide messaging tasks among several dispersed senders. This reduced the concentration of traffic in one spot and made interception more difficult. Forces that had been operating in a fixed pattern for months or years were prone to making rapid changes. These errors could disrupt operations and reduce field efficiency. In some cases, the enemy used the tactic of probability testing to detect fake messages. The method of probability testing involved sending responses that tested the recipient's reaction. If the response was abnormal, the original message was probably fake. Another countermeasure was to make greater use of human networks and ground intelligence sources. Local lookouts and human resources could match intercepts with local observations. The combination of human and electronic resources was used as a verification mechanism. One of the most important lessons was that enemy tactical changes often occurred with a delay. This delay provided a golden opportunity to exploit the information. Rapid and targeted use of information before procedures could be revised provided an operational advantage. But inappropriate or hasty use could reveal the source of the information. In many field operations, commanders followed a use-it-slowly strategy. They used information in operations where its coverage could be reasonably justified. For example, the use of information was chosen to guide reconnaissance patrols or limited bombing. Such actions appeared to come from ordinary sources and helped to conceal the source. In cases where enemy documents or equipment were obtained, the time it took to get them to the decoding centers was critical. Delays in transmission could eliminate the opportunity for immediate use. Couriers, fast lines, and secure channels were created to get critical information. But creating and maintaining such channels itself was a security risk. The enemy also tried to confuse analysts by creating noise and deception in his network. Increasing the volume of messages or sending unimportant messages could lead to saturation of the listening centers. This strategy increased the processing and prioritization costs for the listening party. Using unimportant messages as cover was sometimes successful, but it also consumed internal resources. Technically, changing frequencies and shifting the spectrum made interception more difficult, but frequent frequency changes required compatible equipment and careful coordination between transmitter and receiver. In some forces, outdated equipment prevented the adoption of new frequency mechanisms. The lack of standardization of equipment across units prevented rapid implementation of offensive changes. Another response was to increase operator training in detecting and responding to deception. Training included familiarization with deception styles, refinement of procedures, and detection processes. Code analysts also constantly examined new cryptographic methods and messaging structures. The competition between the two sides proceeded in a cycle of technical and tactical action and reaction. Each security upgrade by one side prompted an attempt by the other to break or circumvent it. In many cases, the leakage of a key or notebook caused a major change in the enemy's communications. These changes sometimes took months to fully implement. In the meantime, Allied analysts tried to exploit the maximum amount of information. A key factor was to maintain the secrecy of the analysis chain so that the enemy would not know that his codes had been broken. Maintaining secrecy meant limiting access to the information and keeping a careful record of its use. In some missions, the use of information was planned to appear to have come from normal sources. This type of information cover-up involved a visible and controlled operation called a cover-up. The creation of a background and parallel evidence to justify the action was an integral part of information exploitation. Successful exploits caused the enemy to devote considerable energy and resources to securing communications. These costs became part of the adversary's strategy and drained their resources. Sometimes the enemy's response to security led to a slowdown in decision-making and a conservative attitude. This change in attitude had a strategic impact.
as the balance between speed and security changed. One important consequence was the growth of specialized structures within the forces for managing secure communications. Cryptography and secure communications units became more formally and centrally organized. These organizations later played an important role in the formation of national intelligence services after the war. Field experience showed that electronic information was valuable when it could be integrated with real operations. Therefore, procedures were developed to converge analysis, reconnaissance, and operational action. Training, joint exercises, and coordination mechanisms between departments became important. In the end, enemy reactions to changing communication procedures demonstrated that organizational and technical flexibility was a determining factor in the survival and continuation of operations. Whichever side was able to adapt more quickly and use its resources more efficiently gained a comparative advantage. The experiences of this period were later recorded as lessons for the design of communications and security systems in the post-war era.
Radar was used as a lens in the darkness of the battlefield to detect threats early. The establishment of coastal radar networks provided early warning lines for the defending forces. Radar operators had to distinguish between real targets and false returns. This skill could only be acquired through experience, practice, and constant analysis. Rapid reaction units were put on alert as soon as they received a warning from radar stations. Field command was directed from joint operations centers to speed up decision-making. In these centers, radar data, electronic interception, and ground reports were integrated. The integration of data created a common operational picture and reduced ambiguity. This picture showed the enemy's movement path, flight altitude, and approximate time of engagement. Air and ground interceptor units were guided by this information. For naval forces, radar played an important role in warning convoys of air attacks. Convoys would change course depending on the threat situation. A timely change of course could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Radio interception was an important complement to radar because it revealed the content of enemy messages. Combining interception with direction finding gave the approximate location of enemy transmitters. This capability was vital for hunting submarines. Submarines were vulnerable when communicating. Intercepting their signals could reveal their location. Surface units were then dispatched at areas where submarines were most likely to be present. In some cases, depth charges were carried out with close coordination between aircraft and ships. The aircraft would detect targets from a distance and relay their coordinates to the ships. This coordination would quickly narrow the enemy's hunting circle. In contrast, submarines would adopt radio silence and evasive maneuvers to break the siege. But radio silence reduced coordination between submarines and central command. Defending forces would use electronic warfare to enhance pursuit. Radio jammers would create noise, making enemy communications unsafe or impossible. This disruption would slow down the enemy's message exchange rate. Slowing down the message exchange rate meant more time for intercepting units. In some operations, jamming and deception were used simultaneously to create chaos in the enemy network. Deception could lead the enemy to the wrong area. This same mistake would clear the way on the other side. Some operations used fake messages to show the imaginary movement of troops. By analyzing the messages, the enemy would move his forces to less important areas. As a result, the main concentration of troops would be left more defenseless. In the field, eavesdropping played an important role in revealing the enemy's support lines. Intercepting messages could determine the route of supply columns. Attacking these columns would disrupt enemy support. Disrupting logistics would weaken the enemy's ability to continue the battle. Eavesdropping centers were located far from the front line to avoid direct fire. These centers were usually connected to secure lines for sending information. To protect the information chain, messages were classified and encrypted.
the security of message transmission was as important as the accuracy of the information. In some cases, information was transmitted manually by liaisons. This physical transmission was slower but more secure. At command centers, analysts were tasked with comparing data from multiple sources. Multi-dimensional analysis prevented erroneous decisions. On the air front, interceptors were guided by radar data. Ground-based radars reported the attacker's course and altitude. Interceptors were dispatched with real-time information to intercept the enemy. Careful coordination helped reduce fuel and time losses. Enemy interference could degrade the quality of radar data. In response, the defending forces used multiple stations to stabilize the data. Overlapping radar fields of view prevented the enemy from escaping blind spots. One of the most important challenges was distinguishing friendly targets from enemy targets. Radio identification codes were used to prevent mistakes. However, fog, night, and ambient noise made the task difficult. Operators had to constantly monitor and analyze data. The command network made the best decisions by combining data. Experience showed that speed in decision-making was as important as accuracy. Delays in reaction could lead to enemy penetration. To reduce delays, some decisions were delegated to frontline units. This delegation of authority allowed for faster local response. In the naval field, radar was useful for detecting fast boats. Fast boats were difficult to see with the naked eye in the dark. Radar was able to detect even in bad weather conditions. In coastal operations, coordination was carried out between artillery and defensive radar. The artillery quickly pinpointed the target with radar information. This coordination greatly increased defensive firepower. To counter this power, attacking forces used smoke, maneuver, and low altitude. Flying at low altitudes made radar detection more difficult, but flying low made them vulnerable to light brown fire. The electromagnetic pollution of the battlefield sometimes reduced the effectiveness of systems. Interference between friendly and enemy systems sometimes made it difficult to detect signals. Frequency spectrum management became an important part of operational planning. Commanders prioritized bandwidth allocation to critical systems. This allocation depended on the type of operation and the immediate threat. In some operations, temporary shutdowns of some systems were implemented to reduce detection. Temporary shutdowns provided concealment or reduced enemy electronic visibility. At the tactical level, shutdowns were associated with increased stealth. But the command had to be aware of the reduction in intelligence. To compensate for the blackout, ground networks sent more reports. Coordination between ground and radar networks increased the speed of decision-making. In mountainous areas, it was important to locate radar stations at high altitudes. Higher altitudes expanded the radar's visibility. But high-altitude deployments required difficult engineering and support. In forested areas, leaves and moisture affected radar reflections. These effects created noise and false returns. Operators had to distinguish real returns from specific patterns. Human error was an inevitable part of the cycle. Continuous training and education were essential to reduce errors. Technical support teams were expected to be deployed near the lines to troubleshoot problems. These teams would perform rapid repairs to keep systems from going down. Physical protection of the stations from shell fire was a priority. Camouflage was constructed to conceal the locations of the stations. Electronic masking was also implemented to reduce signal detection. Enemy positions were sometimes identified through a combination of radar and interception data. Attacking these positions quickly disrupted the enemy command network. Disruption of enemy command led to a reduction in the accuracy of subsequent operations. Reduced enemy accuracy benefited the defending forces. By the end of this section, experience had shown that the most successful operations were those that used radar, interception,
EW, and field command data in a coordinated structure. This coordination became the mainstay of information and electronic warfare in various theaters of World War II.
Information warfare at the end of World War II clearly demonstrated that accurate and timely information could determine the fate of operations. The ability to hear, decode, and exploit signals gradually became as important as artillery and air power. Radar and interception equipment developed rapidly during the war and reached technical maturity. The creation of interception networks and interception centers required complex organizational structures. These structures included operators, analysts, engineers, and coordinating commanders. Without this human and organizational chain, electronic operational capabilities were virtually useless. One direct consequence was the formation of modern intelligence services and specialized organizations after the war. Many of the experiences at Bletchley Park and similar centers provided the basis for later intelligence services. International cooperation in SIGINT between the Allies also became a model for future intelligence sharing. This cooperation demonstrated that the exchange of classified information between countries could produce enormous strategic results. Field experience showed that the confidentiality of the source of information must always be a priority. Misuse of information could expose the source and destroy strategic value. This lesson led to the development of more rigorous protocols for the management and use of classified information. Storage, classification, and secure transmission routes of data became more systematic after the war. Operational time pressures immediately demonstrated that speed of information transfer in the field was critical. The speed of information delivery to operational units could sometimes be the difference between saving a convoy or losing it. But the effectiveness of information was always dependent on its accuracy and field verifiability. The combination of sources, eavesdropping, radar, visual, and human evidence became the standard for information reliability. Experience showed that multi-source analysis provided the best results in decision-making. Information warfare also advanced technologies related to communications and computing. The need for rapid data processing motivated the development of early computing tools. These developments ultimately contributed to the growth of computing science and information engineering after the war. In the industrial sector, factories and research centers that had worked for the war,
Information warfare at the end of World War II clearly demonstrated that accurate and timely information could determine the fate of operations. The ability to hear, decode, and exploit signals gradually became as important as artillery and air power. Radar and interception equipment developed rapidly during the war and reached technical maturity. The creation of interception networks and interception centers required complex organizational structures. These structures included operators, analysts, engineers, and coordinating commanders. Without this human and organizational chain, electronic operational capabilities were virtually useless. One direct consequence was the formation of modern intelligence services and specialized organizations after the war. Many of the experiences at Bletchley Park and similar centers provided the basis for later intelligence services. International cooperation in SIGINT between the Allies also became a model for future intelligence sharing. This cooperation demonstrated that the exchange of classified information between countries could produce enormous strategic results. Field experience showed that the confidentiality of the source of information must always be a priority. Misuse of information could expose the source and destroy strategic value. This lesson led to the development of more rigorous protocols for the management and use of classified information. The storage, classification, and secure transmission routes of data became more systematic after the war. Operational time pressures immediately demonstrated that speed of information transfer in the field was critical. The speed of information delivery to operational units could sometimes be the difference between saving a convoy or losing it.
But the effectiveness of information was always dependent on its accuracy and field verifiability. The combination of sources, eavesdropping, radar, visual, and human evidence became the standard for information reliability. Experience showed that multi-source analysis provided the best results in decision-making. Information warfare also advanced technologies related to communications and computing. The need for rapid data processing motivated the development of early computing tools. These developments ultimately contributed to the growth of computing science and information engineering after the war. In the industrial sector, factories and research centers that had worked for the war found new uses after the war. Parts of military technology were transferred to civilian applications, such as weather radar and marine navigation. But the transfer of military to civilian knowledge was always accompanied by security considerations. From a tactical perspective, information warfare led to changes in training and command structures. Officers and commanders were required to have a basic understanding of the capabilities and limitations of electronics. Operational units became more flexible by creating signal and EW units within their structures. Information logistics was also recognized as a critical component of operational planning. The provision of antennas, power generators, spare parts, and skilled operators became part of the new war logistics. Security risks posed by electronic communications led to the development of more advanced cryptographic methods. Cryptography and key management emerged as a specialized profession in the military. Laws and procedures for protecting military secrets were strengthened in government structures. At the international level, war experiences formed the basis for subsequent negotiations and treaties in the field of weapons and information. The technical and ethical complexity of some methods also led to post-war legal debates. Topics such as the use of information against civilians or the exploitation of data from unethical experiments were reviewed. Part of the legacy of the war was the creation of frameworks for limited accountability and transparency in the field of information. From a technological perspective, information warfare accelerated innovation in electronics and telecommunications. The development of the transistor, amplifier circuits, and antennas were indirect results of military demand. These components later found widespread use in radio, television, and civilian communication systems. Machine learning and pattern analysis had their roots in statistical and algorithmic methods of warfare. Collaboration between basic science and field operations created a new experience for military and civilian research. From a human perspective, the war experience showed that specialized and trained manpower was the key to victory in the field of information. After the war, investment in cryptography, signal analysis, and telecommunications engineering increased. Academic and research centers quickly defined new courses to support security and industrial needs. Many scientists who had been involved in war projects transferred to industry and academia in the post-war period. This transfer led to rapid technological growth in the following decades. Information warfare also brought about a change in command culture. Information was recognized as a strategic asset. Data-driven decision-making replaced decision-making based solely on intuition or personal experience. This cultural shift also brought challenges, including the risk of over-reliance on incomplete data. War experience taught that field feedback and continuous refinement were necessary to maintain accuracy. In some cases, over-reliance on intelligence led to the parties ignoring evidence on the ground. This cognitive error was later used as a warning in commander training. From an ethical perspective, the use of deception in psychological warfare raised important questions about the legal and humanitarian boundaries. Post-war debates began about the ethical limits of intelligence operations. Many countries developed guidelines and oversight bodies to control intelligence operations. International legal bodies also gradually entered the debate on information warfare. Operational experience showed that it was necessary to adopt a balanced approach between information security and human rights. In the military context, the concept of information superiority became a formal goal in strategic planning. Military forces developed long-term plans to achieve and maintain this superiority. Continued advances in sensing, communications, and cryptography supported these programs. One practical legacy was the standardization of equipment and protocols to facilitate cooperation among allies.
These standards were later applied in multinational military organizations and alliances. Information warfare demonstrated that the security and confidentiality of data were as important as physical protection. As a result, the military created specialized information security and key management units. These units were responsible for protecting signal resources and how they were used. The experience of the war also led to the development of electronic defense and counter-jamming concepts. Countering EW and deception quickly became a research priority. This technology-driven competition established the cycle of action and reaction that would last for decades. At the societal level, public awareness of the importance of information and communications increased. The role of the media in shaping war messages and psychological warfare was also reconsidered. Post-war politicians gradually put the concept of national information security on the agenda. Research and development budgets for communication and eavesdropping technologies increased. The private sector also entered the competition, bringing technology of military origin to the consumer market. This transfer of technology from